Most writers write and publishers publish, but I'd like to introduce you now to a guy who does both. My guest is a local writer and author who's been on both sides of the writing divide for most of his career. He's both an author and a publisher, and if you don't already know him, you will shortly. Welcome to The Right Stuff. I'm Veronique Mandal. Marty Gervais has had and continues to have a very interesting career. A reporter, a columnist, a writer, an author, a publisher, a playwright, a poet laureate, etc. So let's say hello to Marty Gervais. Welcome to The Right Stuff.
Thank you.
Now, we've got so much to talk about, but I bet most people don't know much about you, where you come from and where you grew up and what you did growing up.
Lived here until I was about 11 or 12 and then moved to a small town in what we called in Northern Ontario. It was Bracebridge, and so I went to my elementary school there and high school, and then eventually went to Toronto.
To the big smoke.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when did you first realize that you could write, that you wanted to write? Any description? Were you really young?
I was actually in grade 9. I was scared out of my mind going into grade 9 because my brother warned me going into high school. He said, you will be taking 3 languages. You'll be taking French, Latin, and Shakespeare. And I didn't know what Shakespeare was. I didn't know who spoke Shakespeare. I didn't know what it was. And but fortunately for me, in grade 9, I had a wonderful grade 9 English teacher who introduced me to the Dark Lady Sonnets. And when I saw those by Shakespeare, and then we did Twelfth Night, I knew then I wanted to be a writer. And I maintained that vision, that goal, that dream all through high school. If you and I met in grade 12, you might be going into nursing. I would tell you, I'm going to Toronto, I'm going to become a writer. And I did. That's where I headed.
Yeah. So did you study? Did you?
No, I went to Toronto. I thought with my vast experience of 17 or 18, I was going to write a novel. I was going to be Ernest Hemingway. And that was my new love. And I walked down King Street in Toronto. And at that time, the Toronto Star was at one end, the Globe and Mail was at the other, and they were a block apart. So Hemingway worked for the Toronto Star. So I went to the Toronto Star and applied for a job. I really didn't think of myself as a journalist. I wasn't trained to be a journalist. I wasn't trained really to do anything, and they didn't hire me. And but I walked down to the other end of the block, and I went into the Globe and Mail. And fortunately for me, 2 people had just been fired from the Globe and Mail, and the person who had fired them was under a lot of heat and pressure to find someone new. And I walked in. They needed a copy boy. And he said to me, I didn't have a resume. I didn't even know if there was a job. I just happened to be there. And he said, can you start today? And I said, yes. Do you have a friend? Because he needed another person. And so I got hired, and so did my best friend from Bracebridge. 2 of us got hired as copy boys. And I walked into the newsroom of the Globe and Mail, and I felt like I was at home. And all the people whose columns I've been reading, all of the reporters whose reports I've been reading, they were all there. And in those days, a copy boy actually worked with copy. We used to take stories over the phone, from reporters calling all over the country. And we would have these old teletype machines where we would run the copy, coming in from New York or Los Angeles. And so you had a real sense of how a newsroom worked. And I fell in love, with that industry, and I felt I was in an environment where writing was being done. So I was very close to what I wanted to do.
Now, when did you start writing stories yourself?
Oh, I was writing. I was writing when I was there. I
Mm.
mean, not stories for the newspaper, although they had me do a few things, but I was trying to get published. And I turned from writing stories to writing poetry. And I felt that,
Now, was that a transition? Had you been writing poetry as a younger
I
person?
did some, yeah. I mean, I had a girlfriend, so I wrote her poetry.
That kind of poetry.
And
did any of it survive? Did the relationship survive?
no, neither, neither the poems nor the relationship. But I fell in love with poetry partly because it was introduced to me when I was in Bracebridge. There was a fellow who had come from England, and I went to school with his son, and he was kind of like the unofficial poet laureate of the town. And I went to, I used to go to a lodge in Bracebridge, or just outside of Bracebridge, called Patterson K Lodge, which was owned by Frank Miller, who later became the Premier of Ontario.
Yeah.
And Frank actually lived next door to us. So he would invite us out to the lodge, and this person, this poet, would get up and recite poems. And I thought, I want to do that. I want to be that person. I was inspired.
What was your first book? When did you get published?
My first, can I tell you how I got my first poem?
Absolutely.
Well, I was writing, and I was sending poems out, every week, and I was getting back the rejections. Rejections were coming back just as fast as I was sending them out. And I think, when you send out poetry or stories, you always have to send a self-addressed stamped envelope, right? And I think I failed to do that with this one submission. I think just the whole mechanics of it, got away with, slipped away on me. And so I sent something to the Canadian Forum magazine, which was a big magazine in Canada. Had a lot of political stuff in there, but they also had sort of environmental articles, but they also published poetry. So I sent it to them, and the fellow who selected the poetry was Milton Wilson. And he was well known in the poetry circles, and so I sent him some poems, and he called me, and I was a party going on at my house, at my flat that I was renting in Toronto, and we were all drinking and having a good time, and I could hardly hear him on the phone, and finally I told everyone to stay quiet because Milton Wilson, I said, is on the phone. He's the poetry editor of Canadian Forum, and he's got my poetry, and he's going to tell me that he's accepting my poetry. He heard me say all of this. And then I said, so which poems have you selected? And I could hear him rustling through paper, and I think he just grabbed anyone. There was a poem called Girl on the Subway. He says, Girl on the Subway. Good choice, I said. And I said, anything else? He said, no, that's it. And I said, okay, well, so you've called me to tell me this? And he says, oh, well, don't hang up. He said, could you just give me your address? And that's when I realized that the self-addressed stamped envelope wasn't sent. And I gave him my address. And but I call that moxie,
Yeah, no kidding.
And that's my first published poem. And I only just sort of embarrassed him, I think.
Yeah.
And, but it wasn't a bad poem.
No.
And but I started getting published after that. And then I got together with some people at the old Parliament Street Library in Toronto. And every Saturday afternoon we would get together, we would read each other's work and critique it. And several of those people in that group went on to win the Governor General's Award. So,
Wow.
Yeah. So it
And
was a
so
good group.
eventually you had a book published. Was it poetry?
It was poetry. That was the first thing that I ever published, was a book of poetry. And I published maybe 10 books of poetry, since then.
Of course, you eventually ended up in Windsor.
I did.
And at the Windsor Star, where we worked together.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we had a good time there.
Yeah, we sure did.
Yeah.
And you've written other things besides poetry. We're going to come back to poetry in a minute.
Sure.
But of course, anyone who knows you knows, and anyone in the theater around here knows about the Rum Runners.
Right.
So sort of tell us the genesis of the Rum
Well,
Runners and what took you away from poetry.
Well, I've always had a very keen interest in Essex County and Windsor and in the history. This place is so rich culturally, but also rich in its history. And I would hear stories about the rum running days from time to time, and I even actually wrote a couple of poems about that period. And then eventually, what happened was I was asked to write a play about anything of my choice, and I thought a good play would be to write about the rum running days. And nothing was being published about it. I mean, there wasn't anything really available about the Prohibition period. And so I eventually did the play, and then I had all of this research that was just sitting there. And then someone suggested I should put it together into a book, and I did. And it was an instant bestseller.
Yeah, it's done really well.
Yeah.
And I think it introduced a lot of people to that part of Windsor's history,
Exactly.
people who may not have known all the details.
That's true. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's actually spurred an interest in local history. And
Okay, let's go back to poetry.
sure.
Your new book is Touch the Darkness. And you can see I've flagged all the poems that I really liked.
You're so sweet.
What's your favorite?
Well, the river poems are among my favorites, some of the historical ones.
But I have to tell you, I was really moved by the hands.
Oh, fantastic.
So can you read that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. This is autobiographical, and hands. The first, those that snatched me from my mother and lifted me into the light to my father in a cold corridor at Metropolitan Hospital. From that point on, my life was one of adult hands, a school nun gripping my wrist as she wielded a leather strap, doctors tilting my chin, palms flat against my forehead to find a fever, the priest's rough hands offering to place the host upon my gaping tongue, teachers sliding my fingers off a page to check the scratchings of additions and subtractions. And many years later, my dear mother, just before she died, gently cupping my hands like two tiny doves, assuring me her hands would bake me a pie.
You're watching The Right Stuff, and we'll be right back.